You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. If your home flooded during hurricane season last year, you may still be recovering from the damage. A lot of neighbourhoods flooded as a series of storms impacted the Tampa Bay region. Hurricane Debby, then Helene, and soon after that Milton. And it wasn't just places on the coast. Inland neighbourhoods flooded too. So with hurricane season almost here, what are local governments doing to prevent more flooding, and how are people rebuilding? Well, here to help explain, WUSF journalists Jessica Meszaros, Kerry Sheridan and Steve Newborn. Welcome to you all.
Glad to be here, Matthew.
Same. Thanks for having me.
Well, first, let's just take a glimpse of just how bad it got for some people in Tampa Bay.
Debby just brought unbelievable amounts of sand. You could walk from my pool deck all across the dock. I mean, it was just hard packed sand all over. And we had water on the street. You had to paddleboard on and off the street for 36 hours.
I've had water in my garage a couple times, so this is by far the worst that I've ever seen. There's nothing to compare it to.
That day when we came into the house and I saw the damage that was done and my wife was crying, I was like, I have to call, my friend up and I have to say, is there any way I could rent your house?
We just heard there from Steve Popola, who lives in Hudson, and before that, Douglas Woods, who lives in Land O'Lakes, and Christy Molyneux, who lives on the banks of the Philippi Creek in Sarasota. And these are just a few of the people each of you talked to as you reported on hurricane-related flooding. So I want to hear more about who they are and how the hurricanes affected their homes. So, Jessica, just tell us more about Steve Popola. Who is he? Where does he live? What's his home like now?
Yeah, so Steve Popola is actually a retired police officer. He was one of the emergency responders to 9/11 in New York, and he kind of described like having that experience, to being able to handle this kind of trauma that the storm brought. So Hurricane Helene brought about 4 feet of storm surge into his home in Hudson. He lives along a saltwater canal. Like 2 tons of seaweed of seagrass ended up in his pool, and he had to have that removed. Really intense stuff. His wife and kids hadn't been through anything like that, so it was, he had to kind of be there for them, and he shows up still. The house is still being worked on, and he shows up every day, once a day, and he's having to stay at a friend's house in Brooksville that he's renting from, and basically he's having to rebuild it. But thankfully, he had flood insurance because he is an insurance broker currently. He knew to have that, and so the flood insurance is paying for the repairs, but he's having to pay out of pocket for the rental and, of course, the mortgage at the same time, along with other bills.
Yeah. All right. So, Steve, Douglas Woods, this is somebody you talked to right after the hurricanes swept through last year, dealing with some flooding in his garage by the sounds of things.
Oh, it was more than his garage. I took a trip to, it's called the Lake Padgett's East Subdivision. Now, most of the subdivision is high and dry above water, but you get down to where Douglas lived, and maybe about a dozen homes, you could actually see the road sloping down. There's Cypress Creek is right beyond the woods beyond it. That's a tributary of the Hillsborough River that, of course, floods every time we get one of these big storms. And the entire neighborhood was underwater. I had to walk in. I was wearing Tevas, they're kind of like Crocs, with wearing shorts. And the FHP had these huge trucks with these 6-foot high tires on it going in. And I'm like, can I go in there? And it's like, yeah, just watch out for snakes, right? So everybody had sandbags around their neighborhood, around their homes, and he had sandbags around his garage, and his son is out there taking pictures of crabs swimming. I'm not kidding, crabs swimming in his driveway while this is happening.
No sharks, though.
Well, that comes after the hurricane, right? But the thing about this whole place that I went to is that you could visibly see it go down to Cypress Creek, and the whole impetus for my story is why authorities allowed these places to be built in floodplains to begin with, right? So, we can get into this a little later on in the show, but basically these homes were built 40 years ago when they had fewer regulations. So the crux of my story is what are governments doing now to keep it from happening again? And, so far, not a heck of a lot.
Yeah. Now, when we go to Sarasota and Kerry Christie, who you talk to, sand is the theme of that story, right? Like a lot of it came into her property. Tell us more.
Yeah, Philippi Creek is this major waterway that cuts across central and southern Sarasota and empties out into Sarasota Bay into the Gulf of Mexico there. So a lot of sand and sediment and things just got pushed around that area. And some parts of the creek, you can't kayak through them anymore. You can actually walk across them. And some parts, trees are growing. So what residents really want is for the county to make that deeper so that it actually can hold water again. Otherwise, all that sand has built up, and it's going to make it a lot easier to flood in the future.
Right. So, Jessica, I want to come back to you for a moment because you spoke to a bunch of people across a pretty broad swath of the Tampa Bay region, and a lot of them are working through repairs to their homes. When you mentioned Steve Popola, one thing that really strikes me, looking at the photographs you took, and you can see them on WUSF.org, is all of these homes, they kind of look like I guess they've got the kind of the legs of their pants rolled up, like everything is sort of stripped from the floor to about 3 or 4 feet up, right? So just what's it like walking into one of these homes that's still in a state of disrepair, still being rebuilt?
Well, you can kind of hear it in that soundbite from Steve Popola. It sounds echoey, right? So this is a whole house that has been emptied. And right now, using tile seems to be the best way to manage with floods. If you know there's going to be another flood, carpet is not your friend, wood is not your friend, so tiling. What it's like to walk in, it's pretty devastating. It looks like a home that is under construction, and you can see the damage when there's the water line. Basically, you have to cut the drywall about a foot or so, 1.5 feet. It's recommended from the water line on drywall to prevent mold.
And can you smell it? I mean, is that sort of in the air at all?
Well, this had been the 2 homes that I saw that in particular had been mitigated. I mean, I would say right after a storm, when I've been to people's homes, you can definitely smell it, right after Helene. But at this point, they had been mitigated. And then, of course, then there's someone in Hernando County that I spoke to, Charlotte Wright, and she had no home at all. They had knocked it down. She lives in Weeki Wachee along the Mud River, and she had an empty lot. That was her house. And she also visits there 3 times a week. So, people really miss their homes and their properties.
Yeah, it's emotional seeing the results of that. Now, in terms of practicality, Steve mentions having to rent a friend's house. So they've had to move elsewhere. So what is life like for them on a day-to-day basis? How has it kind of upended their lives, apart from just having to sit down and rebuild your house?
Yeah, so Michael Larkin is someone I spoke to in Pinellas County. He's a federal biologist. His family in Shore Acres, which is a neighborhood that chronically floods, they are still displaced, and they've had to move from rental property to rental property. And so that's also costing him some money in his pocket, right? And he's got these adolescent kids, one in middle school, one in high school. And he said not only has he's noticed that he's more short-tempered, his kids and his wife, they're all arguing as a family more. I think it's just the displacement. He said he's even noticed a change in his kids' grades and his kids' behavior from the displacement. And so it's not just wrecking people's lives financially, but it's taking away that sense of safety and home.
Yeah. Now, Steve, just thinking about what made you want to tell this story. I know you had some personal experience with what it was like to be trapped essentially by floodwaters. How did that sort of inform your reporting?
Right, that was a big motivation for the story. I live in a subdivision that was built in the 80s. It basically has 100 homes, and they all rely on one road to get in. And there's all sorts of creeks and ponds all over the place. Never gave it much thought. I didn't even know I was I'm not in a flood zone personally. I never looked at a flood zone map until this storm hit, and my street was under 3 feet of water. You couldn't get out. I had to rely on a friendly neighbor who's got a big, tall truck so we can get out of there after a couple of days, right? My little Subaru wouldn't make it. So people are stuck in their homes, and the pond behind me probably went up about 3 feet. It was about 3 feet from my home. Luckily, I didn't get any damage in my home. So I was more lucky than people like Jessica here, actually.
Yeah.
But the whole point of the story was, why was this allowed to be constructed to begin with? And the answers I'm getting are, well, these were built in the 80s. They were built before we had a lot of regulations. We can't do anything about it now. And I'm getting a lot of those kind of answers. So there's a lot of talking, a lot of planning, a lot of meetings. What will come of this? Well, I guess we're still waiting to find out.
Okay, so when you think about responsibility, how much lies with homeowners? How much do they have to make sure their homes are flood proof? And what about, you mentioned there's meetings happening, but where does that responsibility lie?
Well, it's always let the buyer beware when you buy a house, right? Like I said, I never looked at a flood map until this happened. And just personally, my home is an island. All the homes are islands in a floodplain zone. I never realized this because I didn't have to buy flood insurance. So the one lesson that I learned that I will try to impart to everybody is buy flood insurance, even if you're not in a flood zone, because the typical windstorm policies that everybody is required to have that has a mortgage does not cover damage from rain or flooding. So this is the main thing you need to do. You need to have flood insurance to cover all that damage. That's the first thing you need to be done. And just be aware of your surroundings. If you're going to buy a house that backs up to a swamp, a bayhead, just be aware that this could happen to you. Just be aware.
Now, Kerry, if you live near a creek or a lake or by the sea, you might expect there could be some flood risk when there's a storm. But, I mean, people you talk to say it doesn't really have to be that way. And you kind of alluded to this at the top of this conversation. So why is that?
Well, Sarasota County has a stormwater department, and it's funded by assessments on property tax. And it has a revenue of about $27 million a year. So there's a whole department of people, I think about 55 altogether, whose job is to go out and clear canals and ditches and make sure that, the stormwater system can work appropriately. Steve, describing where you live, you could have been describing my neighborhood in Sarasota. It's so similar. So many homes built in floodplains, so many places that are near bodies of water that really filled up during Debby, which was a tropical storm when it hit Sarasota. And then there was all this flooding afterwards. So people were really concerned. A lot of people suffered incredible damage, as we've been hearing about. And, the problem is, increasingly, people are saying the county wasn't maintaining the stormwater system the way they should have. That's the concern that residents have.
Well, let's just hear a little bit from your reporting again. Here's Spencer Anderson. He's the Public Works Director from the County of Sarasota, and he says there is actually a lot going on.
We are out there doing tons of work, whether it be out doing maintenance or in the office doing engineering work, regulating development. We just don't talk about it very much. So this is a great opportunity for us to share.
Okay, so that's the view of Spencer Anderson from Sarasota County, but that argument doesn't really hold water with some of the folks that you talk to, right, Kerry?
No, and I've been to some of these meetings that the Stormwater Department is trying to get out there and tell their story. And they want people to understand they are doing a lot of work, like Spencer said. And there's no doubt that they are. When he explained it to me, he said, really the first 6 months after the last hurricane hit was really focused on getting rid of the debris that had fallen, pulling all that stuff out and clearing pathways again. That's a huge amount of work. So residents saying, you need to be working on maintaining your systems. He's like, well, we are. We're working on that more now that we've gotten past the hurricanes.
Yeah. In the end, does this just come down to a question of money? And when you think about who pays for dredging and maintenance, is it the county? Is it somebody else that needs to be stepping in there, or some other government entity?
Well, this is a huge point of contention right now in Sarasota. A lot of people who live along Philippi Creek or who were affected by this flooding that seemed to expand far beyond the creek are saying it needed to be dredged. That creek should have been dredged. It hasn't been dredged or, made deeper where they pull out a lot of sediment and make it deeper again. That hasn't happened since 2001 or 2002. So it's been more than 2 decades that all this silt and sediment and sand has been allowed to build up. So a lot of people in the county are concerned that that needs to happen quickly, and the county says it's actually not the Stormwater Department's responsibility and that they can't because they need a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So they are in the process of getting that permit, and they're going to try and use some federal hurricane relief money to pay for the dredging of Philippi Creek. But that is in addition to this $27 million stormwater department that is pretty well funded for the area. I mean, Manatee County doesn't even have a stormwater department.
Well, you're listening to Florida Matters, and you're hearing from WUSF's Kerry Sheridan. Also with us, Steve Newborn and Jessica Meszaros, and they've been reporting on the lingering aftermath of last year's hurricane flooding and what's been done to prevent that flooding next time. More to come after this. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. With me are WUSF reporters Steve Newborn, Jessica Meszaros, and Kerry Sheridan. Now, if you've experienced the kind of flooding that inundated communities across the Tampa Bay region last year, you know how long it can take to fix the damage. So what are local governments doing to try and prevent the same thing happening next time a hurricane dumps feet of rain on the region? Steve, what can local governments do to prevent that catastrophic flooding that happened last year?
Right, so their options are pretty limited here. I talked to Kyle Dolman. He's the floodplain administrator for Hillsborough County, and he said there's several ways you can minimize future flooding, but none of them come cheap, right? Mm-hmm. You can build ponds to get this excess water. You could buy up floodplains that can soak up the water when it comes in, or you could restrict new developments and therefore restrict any future taxes that are going to come from those areas. Problem is the areas that I went into, at least, were already heavily developed. You can't build new ponds there. You can't buy up any floodplains because whatever's there flooded out already. So the thing they can really do is look at new developments, future plats, and take this into consideration, maybe not build so close to these creeks that flood, to these low-lying areas. But, of course, that's going to eat into their future tax dollars. It's going to take a lot of planning dollars. So
that's also kind of a selling point for new development, right? Like some kind of view of a waterway.
Oh, absolutely, right. Yeah, how many places want waterfront living, right? And they're all built in ponds and, connected streams and such. But basically the answer I got when I asked them this question is, okay, this probably won't happen again, is what they're saying. The floodplain administrator guy that I talked to, he said this probably wasn't even a 100-year flood event because there were 3 major storms in a row, and by the time Milton came by, ground was already saturated. He said it might have been a 500-year event. Now, of course, these 100-year flood events seem to be coming every few years, so I don't know how valid that is. So the best we could do is keep pressure on public officials. Tampa and Hillsborough County are holding a series of public meetings right now to determine what they can do in the future. So keep on the elected officials and make sure they're doing their job.
Well, Jessica, when you talk about people who decide to stick around and rebuild their home, how did they come to that decision? Because it can be a tricky one, right?
Well, it can be tricky. Some people, it's really emotional, and Florida's in their hearts, and they don't want to let go of their waterfront property. But I know for Michael Larkin in Pinellas County, for him, he said it's really his kids and the community that he lives in that's keeping him around for now. He's hoping to wait till his kids graduate high school, but he says if it floods again, that they're leaving. They're going to leave right away. I know that Steve Papola is actually renovating his home to sell it, so he doesn't plan to stick around. That was enough for them, and they're hoping to move to higher ground. And then Charlotte Wright, who I spoke to, she's the one who's like, I'm sticking around. Like this is there's no other peaceful place like this, which I found such a juxtaposition of like the peace that you get here, but then this horrible tragedy comes and like swallows up your home. And
this is the person who her home is completely demolished, but she goes back to visit the plot.
Yeah, she goes to visit her plot. I think at this point they have put down a foundation, but she is along a canal. And while we were doing the interview, a few manatees came up and were actually mating right by where her house was, right by her lot. And so that she's like, that's why I come here. She's like, once you see this kind of stuff, you're hooked.
Yeah. Now you talked about tile going in as that's obviously a good flooring choice if you had wood floors or carpet that got destroyed by flooding, but what else can people do to make their home a little more flood resistant or a little more resilient?
If you know your home is going to flood, there are certain materials you should stay away from and certain materials that you should go for. It seems to be tile is the best one, or like terrazzo stone. If your home comes with that already, keeping it terrazzo stone, just polishing it. You can add tile. And then instead of drywall, you would use Durock. And instead of using a wooden baseboard, using a PVC baseboard and things like that. You can elevate your electrical outlets so that your electrical system doesn't short once flooding comes in, and then that's a whole other game. And then, of course, there's the ultimate thing you can do, which is to elevate your home. It is very costly. The state of Florida recently just had its Elevate Florida program. I believe it's already closed, though, the application process, in which the state is using federal grants to help pay for 75% of elevation to somebody's home. But that can still be extremely expensive.
Yeah, I think we saw that in some communities, like after Hurricane Michael, I want to say, up in the Panhandle area. Like some of the homes that survived were those homes up on stilts that were built pretty robustly.
Drive through Shore Acres right now, and I saw some really interesting stuff. Some really old Florida homes, probably built in the 50s, so high up there. I mean, you can tell it's a really old house, and then it's just like it's extremely high up. It's really fascinating to see.
Mm-hmm. Now, what impact is the flooding going to have on who gets to live in certain parts of Florida? Because there are certain things you have to do. You mentioned, I think Steve mentioned flood insurance, but is this going to lead to some kind of economic gentrification, I guess? Like,
yes.
Who gets to live where and what parts of Florida?
Yeah, there's actually a researcher out of the University of Southern California. Her name is Santina Contreras, and she told me specifically, like, after natural disasters, there's definitely gentrification that happens. And Steve Papola, who is an insurance broker, I asked him, who's going to be able to live here? And he said the rich. He's like, this is not a medium to low income game to live on the water. If you're not properly insured, you're going to have to pay out of pocket. The insurance is expensive. For instance, Charlotte Wright, who lives along that Mud River in Hernando County, was saying, that she got a quote at one point for flood insurance of $18,000. So they went without flood insurance, and so now they're paying out of pocket to elevate the home. So all of this costs money. Whether you get flood insurance, whether you decide to stay and it's a risk to rebuild, all of it is going to be costly. So really, it's going to, down the line, it seems like a rich person's game.
Yeah, it's definitely going to change the fabric of some of these communities. Kerry, you also talked to a bloke called Jake Crabtree. Just tell us a little more about his experience of hurricane season 2024. What was that like, and what did he tell you about how the county's dealing with Philippi Creek?
Yeah, Jake was one of the people who lived on Philippi Creek and whose home flooded 3 times this past season. So Debby, Helene, and Milton. During Debby, he had to take his family out in the middle of the night because the rain had kind of subsided a bit. It wasn't as heavy as it had been all day, but the waters kept rising, and it was a really terrifying time. So water's rushing into your house. It keeps rising, and he had to open his door at one point, and then even more water rushed in, and he had to take his wife and his teenage daughter and a tortoise and a dog all out into the road to get help in the middle of the night. Terrifying experience. No one wants to go through that again. He's living with his in-laws now while they try to get their home repaired. And he, like many people in Sarasota who've been affected like this, they've become activists in a way. They've formed this group called Supporters of Action Now for dredging. They're really pressuring the county to do more. They're meeting with officials every week or every month at least to try to get them to really take action so that this sort of flooding doesn't happen again. Whether they can do that, remains to be seen.
Yeah, actually, that story of having to evacuate in the middle of the night, that reminds me a little bit of some of the reporting you were doing last year, Jessica, and talking to those folks, I think, who were kind of having to try and evacuate their neighbors, like on their trucks, if they had elevated trucks. So some scary times there. Yeah,
the Town and Country neighborhood in Hillsborough County, around 1 a.m., the water started rising. And those who had trucks brought on their neighbors' dogs, and got out of there. Even though they had been told, hey, you should evacuate, they didn't expect it. A lot of them have lived there 30 years and hadn't seen anything like that. And then they mentioned all of the boats, because it's such an ominous time. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. It's pitch black outside, and you're hearing boats and motoring down your street.
Yeah. Now, Steve talked a little bit about some of his firsthand experience of hurricane flooding, sort of shaped his reporting. I know that both you, Jessica, and Kerry also had some experience of that. Jessica, what was your experience like, and how did that sort of inform what you were doing to report on the story?
My experience was what Steve reported on. That was my life. I bought my home not in a flood zone specifically back in 2020. I was like, I love Pinellas. I want to live there, but I'm scared of how close it is to the water. Well, joke was on me during Hurricane Milton. I don't live anywhere. I don't live specifically near any water body, but I guess the amount of rainfall brought in about 3 inches of fresh water. So, based on what I've seen in my own reporting, it wasn't that bad, but it still messes everything up. And so my fiance and I having to rip up the baseboards, pulling out the carpeting and the fake, wood floors and stuff like that. And just to make sure, and cutting out the drywall, spraying bleach on it, making sure that it's not creating mold, and all of this after, working here overnight to make sure that everyone had what they needed to stay safe. And so it was a very overwhelming time, and it really put into perspective what people have to go through, how tiring physically, emotionally, because we spent 2 nights in a row staying up till 1 a.m., securing the home for the storm. Then we worked during the storm, and then afterward, all that went into it, and not having power for 10 days. And so that was a very exhausting time, but it definitely made me really shape the questions that I asked. It really put into perspective how, because when we had to adapt, we got the PVC baseboards, we cut out the drywall, and we're not replacing it in the 3 inches down, because what's the point? I don't want to get mold. And so we put some giant PVC baseboards to cover up the holes that where the drywall would be. And we kept the terrazzo stone, thankfully, which was underneath all of that, and just had that polished for a very cheap, as much, that's all that we could afford at the time. And so it really helped me to understand what people are going through. It was a devastating time, and still is. Our home still doesn't have all the baseboards put in, and we're still painting. So all this time later. A
long recovery. And Kerry, you I remember Hurricane Debby was a bad one for you, right? You were sort of trapped in your home for a bit by some floodwaters there.
Yes, I live in a neighborhood built in the 1980s. My home was in an ex-flood zone, or not in a flood zone, when we bought it in 2018. That's changed a little bit, but my family was out of town. My husband and kids were visiting in-laws, and I was working on the storm coverage, of course, and in the morning, the rain had stopped for the most part, but the water kept rising, and I was looking at it out my window, and I'm like, oh, it's, a foot away from the door. Oh, it's 6 inches away from the door. Oh, my goodness, and is it going to keep rising? It was terrifying, and other people in my neighborhood had water go into their homes. There's a feeling of helplessness when you're trapped like that, because you can't get out, you can't do anything. I could see my neighbor's car flooded across the street, and I couldn't, it was way too late for him to drive it over to my driveway, which was a little higher. So, experiencing it in that sense really gives you an empathy for the people that you talk to. You may not have experienced the exact same thing, but you can understand what they went through.
Can I add something real quick? Sorry.
Sure.
Something else that I wanted to mention is not only do I cover, of course, breaking news and the natural disasters, but the context of climate change. And so my personal experience was all of my reporting right in my face, because this was not a storm surge event. This was a precipitation event. And what we know about climate change is that it's not only making storms stronger, but wetter. So more rain is falling. And because of the amount of rain that we saw during Milton, that's the reason why so many more inland areas are flooding that we had not seen flooding in before. So literally, it has informed all of my reporting, not only in disaster coverage, but how climate change is impacting people right now.
Well, Steve Newborn, Kerry Sheridan, and Jessica Meszaros reporting on flood impacts from last year's hurricanes and what's being done to head off flooding from future storms is over at WUSF.org. Thank you all for sharing your stories and sharing your reporting with us.
Thank you,
Matt.
Thanks.
That's our show for this week. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and watch on YouTube. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Jackson Harp engineered this episode. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you so much for listening.